is the one subject in British politics where everyone lies. Politicians lie by pretending mass migration is something that just happened to us rather than a deliberate policy choice. Officials lie by massaging definitions, so you never quite know who counts as a migrant, who's an asylum seeker, who's a student, and who quietly disappears into the black economy. And the rest of us lie to ourselves, because it feels easier to repeat slogans about diversity being our strength and stop the votes than to admit the experiment isn't working the way we were promised. Let's start with the scale, because that's the bit that gets buried in euphemisms. The Office for National Statistics has now quietly revised Britain's recent migration numbers upwards again. According to its latest methodology, net migration peaked at about 944,000 in the year to March 2023. That's roughly the population of Birmingham in a single year. Net migration has since fallen, but only because the peak was so absurdly high. The ONS now puts net migration for the year to June 2025 at around 204,000, down from 649,000 the year before. But that doesn't mean fewer people are coming in. Immigration is still enormous, about 898,000 arrivals in that period. What's changed is that more people are leaving, and migration has surged to around 693,000, including more than 250,000 British citizens moving abroad. So the drop in net migration isn't a success story. It's immigration staying high while more and more people decided that they've just had enough and move abroad. In the year to June 2024, official population estimates suggested that around 98% of UK population growth came from net migration. So when people complain that their town doesn't feel English anymore, on one level, that's just maths. In 1991, around 7% of people in England and Wales were born abroad. By 2021, it was 18.6%. That's more than 1 in 6 people. And in London, the foreign-born share of the population is close to 40%. This isn't a gentle generational shift. It's a rapid demographic shock, layered on top of stagnant wages, collapsing public services, and a housing market where the average home now costs 8.6 years of disposable household income and is only realistically affordable for the richest 10%. And prices aren't rising by accident. They're rising because Britain simply isn't building enough homes to absorb the extra 944,000 people added to the population in just 1 year. If you design a country where locals can't afford kids or a house, then import hundreds of thousands of people a year to keep GDP graphs pointing up, don't be surprised when the social contract snaps. And now add crime to that picture. In November 2025, a man went on a stabbing spree on an LNER train travelling from Peterborough towards London. 11 people were injured and the train was halted at Huntingdon under the marauding attack protocol before counter-terror police ruled out a terror motive. Within hours, officials and fact-checkers were loudly stressing that the suspect was British-born, even as passengers described a chaotic, violent attack that looked exactly like the incidents politicians keep insisting has nothing to do with the wider debate. Lord Hannon, writing in The Spectator, pointed out the obvious problem with this spin. Most of the high-profile attackers the authorities are trying to calm you about are sons of immigrants. UK-born, yes, but often shaped by imported conflicts, imported ideologies, and imported family cultures that are completely at odds with the assumptions of a liberal country that used to think of itself as boringly safe and stable. You see the same pattern in the data on violent crime. Knife possession is spread across all groups, but when you zoom in on knife murders in London, a 2022 London-level survey cited by commentators and crime analysts found that Black Londoners, who make up around 13% of the city's population, were linked to around 61% of knife murder suspects, with white suspects just under a fifth. Now, obviously, most Black Brits are not criminals. But pretending the pattern doesn't exist because it's uncomfortable guarantees that you never ask why some groups are so heavily overrepresented and what that means for future immigration. The point here isn't that immigrants equal crime. It's that who you bring in, from where, and in what numbers matter. We already know that foreign nationals are heavily overrepresented in some of the most serious crime categories, with London data showing that between 40 and 47% of those charged with sexual offences last year were non-UK nationals, and convictions of foreign nationals for sexual offences rising 62% since 2021. People shaped by decades of clan politics, honour culture, or sectarian violence don't magically dissolve into John Lewis Britain because they watch Blue Peter. Then there's the grooming gang scandal and the cousin marriage question that respectable Britain still tiptoes around, but unfortunately, the NHS can't afford to. For years, the official line from the Home Office was that most group-based child sexual exploitation offenders were white and that there was no reliable evidence of ethnic overrepresentation. A 2020 paper on group-based child sexual exploitation went out of its way to stress the limited data on ethnicity and to downplay any links to specific communities. Now fast forward to 2025 and Baroness Casey's national audit of grooming gangs says something completely different. Local data from Greater Manchester and Yorkshire shows suspects in group-based child sexual exploitation cases were disproportionately likely to be Asian men of Pakistani heritage. The audit also found that ethnicity wasn't even recorded for roughly two-thirds of suspects, and she described the national data on grooming gangs as a bloody disaster. In other words, the same state that insists it can socially engineer an entire country through mass migration somehow can't tick a box when men in organized networks are raping children. Now layer in something even more taboo, consanguinity, or more specifically cousin marriage, in parts of the very communities we're talking about. The Born in Bradford project, a major long-running study of a heavily Pakistani heritage city, found that first cousin marriages double the risk of congenital anomalies from about 3% to 6%, and explain roughly 30% of genetic disorders in that cohort. Reviews of child deaths in places like Bradford, Birmingham, and Redbridge suggest 20 to 40% may be linked to genetic disorders associated with cousin marriage and chromosomal conditions. You don't have to moralize about anyone's culture to see the public health problem here. If you import large communities where close kin marriage is normal, and those communities form very tight kinship networks, you create areas where a huge share of childhood illness, disability, and infant death is driven by inherited disorders. The NHS then has to carry those costs for generations. When you combine tight kinship structures with deeply patriarchal attitudes, you also create precisely the environment that allowed grooming gangs to flourish. Young girls outside the tribe treated as fair game, victims disbelieved, and the authorities terrified of being called racist if they say out loud what everyone on the ground can see. Do you remember Jack Straw, a former Home Secretary, who was dragged for saying Pakistani men instead of the sanitized Asian men in Blackburn nearly 15 years ago? Now, if he couldn't speak plainly, who on earth could? This is what parallel lives really looks like. It's not about food or clothing. It's about entirely different moral universes living side by side with the state too timid to defend its own norms. At that point, you're forced to confront a much bigger question. What is the mainstream everyone is supposed to integrate into? And this is the very difference between multi-ethnic and multicultural societies. People used to think of Englishness as quite straightforward, a bit self-effacing, suspicious of ideology, queasy about uniforms, culturally Christian even if you never go to church. The kind of place where you could put a scarf on a statue and call that a riot. Now look at our politics. In the Rochdale by-election, George Galloway explicitly ran as the Gaza candidate and won on the back of a bloc vote driven by foreign policy in the Middle East. In the 2024 general election, Labour MPs across heavily Muslim seats openly warned their leadership that they were bleeding support over Gaza, and independents ran explicitly on sectarian lines. Now you can argue about the rights and wrongs of Gaza all day long. That's not the point. The point is that we now have sizable communities whose primary political loyalty is to overseas causes and a political class that panics every time those voters threaten to walk. Once you have that, what it means to be English inevitably changes. It stops being about a shared civic identity and becomes a bargaining process between rival blocs. Who gets to fly which flag, whose historic grievances get center stage, whose religious sensitivities are treated as sacred, and whose are mocked on Channel 4 for ratings. And under all this sits the bluntest question of all: who pays? There is no way of having an honest immigration debate without talking about money. The British state is an enormous redistributive machine. Take from a relatively small group of high earners, spread it across everyone else in the form of cash benefits, tax credits, schooling, the NHS, policing, social housing, and pensions. According to the ONS and the Treasury's own analysis, median household disposable income in 2023 and 2024 was in the low to mid 30,000s. Now, in a given year, more than half of households are net beneficiaries once you add up benefits and the cash value of services and compare it to the taxes that they pay. Flip that around, the system is effectively funded by a minority of households towards the top of the income distribution. In fact, the top fifth of households pay roughly two-thirds of all income tax, and the top 10th alone pay just over half. So when we talk about whether an immigrant is a net contributor or a net cost, we're not talking about whether they have a job. We're talking about whether they earn enough over a lifetime to land firmly in that high tax, low benefit slice of the population. The Institute for Fiscal Studies' work on taxes and benefits has shown that over a lifetime, the vast majority of people do eventually pay more in tax than they receive in cash benefits, particularly men who spend most of their life in work. But in any given year, most households don't cover their own share of spending, especially when you add kids, healthcare, and pensions into the mix. Put crudely, a household with one part-time worker on £22,000 a year and 3 school-aged children is almost certainly a net recipient from the state. A dual-earner professional household on 6 figures is almost certainly a net payer. Based on where the tax burden actually sits, you don't need a PhD to work out which type of immigrant the system can carry more of. And this is where our immigration debate is almost completely dishonest. We're reporting large numbers of people into a welfare state that is already overstretched, and refusing to ask or refusing to publish hard numbers on their long-term fiscal impact. When the numbers do come out, they're often averaged in a way that hides the obvious. Migrants from wealthy, high-skilled, culturally similar countries tend to be strong net contributors, and large-scale low immigration from poorer, more fragile countries is much more likely to be a net cost. That's not racism, it's basic maths. A recent report from the Public and Commercial Services Union and the Campaign Coalition Together with Refugees claims that each refugee could add more than £260,000 to the UK economy if the asylum system is reformed exactly as they propose. Their model assumes refugees will be in work within 18 months of arrival, learn English fluently, and find above average jobs. But Home Office data show only 12% of resettled refugees were employed in 2021, and just 5.1% held professional roles, while over 54%, that's over half, lived in social housing. Meanwhile, Europe-wide studies show asylum migrants often impose net costs of hundreds of thousands of euros, and the Office for Budget Responsibility has warned that low-wage migrant inflows produce a negative lifetime fiscal impact. So for refugees who on average arrive with lower skills, poor English, and greater health barriers to outperform the average migrant is fantasy economics, I'm sorry. Other countries have understood this and acted accordingly. Denmark has tightened its asylum rules to the point where it effectively deters almost everyone except those with cast iron claim. It's experimented with the idea of offshore processing and made it clear that permanent settlement is not an automatic right. The explicit aim here is to avoid exactly the kind of parallel societies and imported conflicts that Britain is now wrestling with. Take Japan, for example, as well. For all its problems, it still has a foreign-born population of under 3% and extremely strict conditions for permanent settlement and citizenship, including language, conduct, and integration requirements. It understands that once you change the demographic fabric of a country, you don't get to change it back. Even countries that once prided themselves on being humanitarian superpowers, like Sweden, for example, have slammed on the brakes after seeing neighborhoods descend into gang violence and bombings. By contrast, the UK has tried to combine high-volume migration, a generous universalist welfare state, and a weak, guilt-ridden sense of national identity. Then reacts shocked when that mix produces volatile politics, imported sectarianism, and a permanent argument about who really belongs in this country. Then there's the cousin marriage bit again, because this is not just about health, it's about how power works. If you design an immigration system that allows large chain migration from tightly knit clans, you're not just importing individuals, you're importing structures. You entrench voting blocks that can be mobilized by local power brokers. You make it much harder for young people in those communities to marry out, live independently, or adopt mainstream norms because their entire social and economic world is trapped inside an extended family web. The Bradford data shows something interesting here. Consanguinity and its health impacts do tend to decline over generations as later generations integrate into wider British society, but that process is slow and uneven. If you keep topping up that system with fresh arrivals from villages where cousin marriage is still the default, the public health and social consequences never really clear. You just keep resetting the clock. That is the bit of the immigration debate that no one in mainstream politics wants to touch. It's much easier to talk about values in the abstract than to admit that in some places, the state is now permanently negotiating with informal clan structures that it barely understands. So where does that leave us? If you strip away the slogans, there are some fairly obvious conclusions here. First, numbers matter. You cannot add the equivalent of a Birmingham every year to an island with a broken housing market, an NHS on its knees, and a creaking school system and expect social harmony. The revised migration figures are an admission of elite failure on an epic scale. Secondly, composition matters. It's not racist to say that importing large numbers of people from countries with high levels of corruption, clan politics, sectarianism, and honor violence is riskier than admitting small numbers of highly skilled migrants from countries that are broadly similar to us. The data on crime, grooming gangs, and sectarian voting patterns all point in the same direction, even if the government is still trying very hard not to join the dots. Thirdly, culture matters. You can't endlessly tell school children that their country is essentially a story of racism, slavery, and empire, and then act surprised when the children of immigrants feel no particular loyalty to it and are easily mobilized around overseas causes. Likewise, you can't pretend that extremely tight kinship networks and cousin marriage norms are just food and festivals. They have real consequences for health, for crime, for social trust, and for how power operates at a street level. And finally, honesty matters. If Britain wants to remain a generous, open, liberal democracy, it cannot afford to lie to itself about immigration. That means publishing proper crime and grooming data, including ethnicity and immigration status, and doing so consistently, instead of cherry-picking whichever dataset best suits the narrative of the day. It also means setting clear income and contribution thresholds for long-term residency and citizenship, and being willing to say out loud that some cultural practices are simply incompatible with the kind of country we want to be. Because the alternative is what we have now, A political class that congratulates itself on diversity while quietly turning the country into a patchwork of gated tribes, a police force that worries about headlines more than victims, and a population that is told to shut up and pay the bill. The immigration debate no one wants to have is exactly the debate we're going to be forced into, whether we like it or not. The only real question is whether we do it with our eyes open and hard numbers, or wait until another atrocity, another riot, another grooming gang scandal pushes people past the point of caring about polite euphemisms. At some point, a grown-up country has to behave like one. That means saying numbers matter, culture matters, borders matter, and honesty matters most of all. We either confront all four or accept the consequences of refusing to.